Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. On this episode, I talked to Pam Larrichia about unschooling, awkward conversations about parenting, and ways we can work on connecting more with our kids and each other. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Pam Larrichia. She's an author, podcaster, blogger, parent. She wears a lot of hats, and I'm really excited to have her on the podcast. Welcome to We Don't Talk About That, Pam.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited.
I invited you to talk because you and I both are unschooling parents and unschooling families, and that's something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And I know for families who do unschooling and for families who do homeschooling, that can often be difficult conversations that they have with people about their choices to homeschool and to unschool. And so I thought it would be fun to talk to you about that and hear some of your perspectives on that. So first, would you just tell us a little bit about your journey, how you ended up unschooling, and maybe a little bit about what unschooling is in the process?
Sure. Well, I guess our journey started when my eldest son's kind of spirited style did not mesh very well with the classroom environment. So the first few years, I was working and I worked with his teachers and school principals over those early years, had lots of conversations with them, did all sorts of things. But eventually came to see that there was just a fundamental disconnect between the school's teaching style and my son's learning style. Mm-hmm. I had left work the year before to stay home and was doing more research. Research is kind of my thing. I was always trying to learn things, trying to figure things out, trying for things to make sense. That was something that was and continues to be very important to me, that things just make sense to me, like what I'm seeing in front of me. So I was seeing my son all the time, and then I was seeing him in school and hearing about, what was going on there, and then his perspective. Eventually doing my research, I came across the term homeschooling. Mm-hmm. I was like, whoa, that sounds curious. And I dove down that rabbit hole, right? Mm-hmm. A few weeks later, my husband and I had decided to give it a shot. Let's try it for a year, see what happens. And so it was March break, actually, and the kids were home, and I went around to each of them individually, and I said, hey, you know what? I discovered that you don't actually have to go to school to learn, because that used to be something, you have to go to school. Let's make it as fun as we can. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I said, you don't actually have to go to school. You can stay home to learn. Would you like to do that? And all three of them were like very enthusiastic about that choice. Mm-hmm. So that is basically kind of how we started. And then I was researching homeschooling and quickly found unschooling, and that really connected with me. And then I just spent, I would say, like the next few months really learning much more about unschooling, discovering so much about that, and then watching my kids and being with my kids and seeing it in action. So it just made more and more sense, and we never turned back after that.
Yeah. So for folks who aren't familiar with unschooling, maybe we can kind of unpack a little bit what it means
what
and
is.
what it looks like, because I think people hear it and in unschooling circles, people talk about it being a sort of an unfortunate term in some ways because it's primarily negative and it's focused on being against schooling or unschooling. I don't mind it so much, but it does take some maybe time to explain it to people who aren't familiar. So what does it look like?
Yeah.
And I know it looks like a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, but what are some basic ideas and principles about unschooling?
Yeah, I totally get the feedback about the term. I mean, for me, there's also positive ways, you know, for looking at that. To me, it's a releasing feeling, an opening feeling. But anyway, really at its heart, it's just creating a different kind of learning environment for our kids, right? At the beginning, especially for people like me who come from their kids being in school, right? Instead, unschooling really embraces how humans naturally learn. You know, following our curiosity and wanting to figure out how to do the things that we want to be able to do, just like our kids learn to eat and to walk and to talk. And the understanding that can continue, that is a human instinct and urge, and that if we don't tamp down on it, it continues. There's definitely a misconception that unschooling is about leaving our kids to fend for themselves, right? You know, it's that we're taking away school, but they stop there. It's no, we're replacing it with a different kind of lifestyle. Really, it's about developing strong and connected relationships with our kids, building trust in each other, because in that environment, learning naturally thrives, and it really just becomes a lifestyle that the whole family lives. And it really gets rid of the idea that learning is something kids have to do between certain ages, right?
Or between certain hours of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And certain subjects, that's another big thing, right? That all learning is important, not just stuff that's been put in a curriculum, right?
Right.
Valuing all kinds of learning, and how important that is for each child. I end up talking about how curiosity really creates such a personalized curriculum. You know, when you're talking to somebody who's new to the idea, that it's not about not learning, because so often when what we learn or think about kids conventionally is that they don't like learning, right? So of course they're going to think that if you take away that school component, they're never going to learn anything, because you need to make them learn the things that they need to know, right? But that's really not the way things work, the way human beings work when they're given that space. And the relationship with our kids is super important, because you need that trust so that they'll come to you with questions, right? So that you can have conversations with them. So you can know the things that they want to do, the things that they like, and you can bring more of those things into their lives, so that learning just bubbles naturally through your days all the time. Right?
Yeah, I love that you pointed to curiosity. It's something that comes up a lot in this podcast when I'm talking to people about how to have difficult conversations. The idea of curiosity is a huge part of being able to talk about hard things, where we can sort of get curious about what's happening. And so we talk about that
so much.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. And here you're kind of instilling that almost in your kids from the beginning through unschooling by saying their curiosity is the leader, right? And we can trust that curiosity and cultivate it a little bit. And I think that probably helps. In my experience, a lot of kids who have been unschooled, you can have really interesting conversations, and they are very curious. And so they have that already sort of built in as they're growing. As we said, it's natural, but then it also helps with being able to have harder conversations as well. So that's a really interesting connection I hadn't made before.
Yeah, no, that's the cool thing, is because curiosity really is innate
Mm-hmm.
In human beings. And your point about cultivating it, that's the important piece, because when you start school and those more conventional parenting aspects where the kids need to conform to the adult's structure, so often we're trying to tamp down on that curiosity because it takes our kids places that we're not wanting them to go right now. Like, at school, you need to follow the curriculum, not what you're curious about.
Right.
Even within a topic.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So often our conventional lifestyles tamp down that curiosity and eventually turn it off. Whereas we can cultivate it by actually being responsive, answering their questions, helping them explore the things that they're drawn to. And we can keep that curiosity alive.
And you mentioned that this idea of unschooling is kind of a lifestyle. It's a whole life thing that sort of you embrace about, because we don't stop learning, because we're not using a curriculum, because we're following curiosity. So it really involves so much of your life, and it isn't just set aside to the time that you're, quote unquote, doing school. And one of the things about unschooling that is interesting, I find people on kind of a spectrum from the more radical unschoolers. That's what I tend to gets labeled people who are embracing a lot of principles maybe that come out of this idea of unschooling beyond the learning. And we would probably consider ourselves a radical unschooling family. There are other unschoolers who are primarily focused on this as the way that their children learn, and they may not be embracing some of the other things. So some of the more radical things, like our family doesn't really have a set bedtime. There's a lot of freedom and choice around food and what they eat. We're not controlling that. And those are the things about unschooling, I think, when I've noticed news stories or that get picked up about unschooling tend to focus on those things, or screen time is a big one, right? If we don't, the common wisdom these days is that, you have to limit screen time. And so if we aren't limiting screen time, that kind of seems to scare some people. I don't know what my question was going to be. I'm trying to think. Well, one of the things that happens is because some of those more radical things especially do cause people to have fear or be nervous, have anxiety about what you're doing, which is strange because it's not, their family, but whatever. I tend to say to a lot of people, I choose very carefully who I really unpack the more radical lifestyle aspects of unschooling with, because it is kind of a shock to some people. So sometimes I call it, we're very laid back homeschoolers or something along those lines. And it's funny because my wife is very excited that I'm talking to you today, but I also know that she is often very nervous. I'm the more extroverted one in our family, and so I'm often the one that's happy to talk about unschooling and very open about what it is. And she's the one that's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you talked to them or said that. They're going to think we're crazy or whatever. And so now I'm doing a podcast with you, and it's, it's too late now. Everybody's going to know. But how do you...
You're out.
Yeah, we're out. This is our coming out episode. So what, for you, I know that's the same thing that a lot of people struggle with, deciding who to talk to about it. How do you talk to people about it, or what are the awkward questions you get? So what are some ways for you that this choice to unschool has made conversations difficult for you? And then how do you deal with that?
So one thing I just wanted to touch on when you were talking about the radical side of unschooling, for me, where that light bulb moment was, or moments became, is that those are really also about learning, right? It's not separating parenting or those different choices from the learning. Like that's part of, we were talking before about expanding what is learning. It's not just the curriculum, that learning what foods feel good, feel weird in our body, learning how much sleep makes our body feel good, like learning all those things about ourselves and how our body ticks, how our personality ticks, right?
Yeah, it's like physical learning that kids are. It's a very tangible learning. Whereas traditionally, I think we think, well, the parents instruct them. You tell them, 8 hours, and so this is bedtime. This is when you get up, or you don't know what's good for you. Here are the list of things to eat, and you just need to learn by me instructing you. And we don't trust that. There are other kinds of learning with their bodies, being connected to understanding how they feel. All of those things are also learnings, as you're saying, and it's not all instructive learning. It's very experiential and practical.
And the same with and that's the same with tech. And I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I loved to read, and I would, lay on the couch for hours during the day reading, and my mom would come by, get outside. It's the same kind of thing, but I would get up and move when I was uncomfortable anyway. But that's what I mean about how it's all learning. And people eventually, when their parents aren't there to control them, right, are going to try and figure this out.
Yep.
Right? I mean, I remember going off to university that first year, how many kids, didn't understand themselves, and it was so much of a free-for-all is probably the best, way to describe it, because they didn't understand themselves to know, gee, I need this much sleep, or gee, I need to, this kind of food, or all that kind of stuff. And they had to eventually learn it. The great thing about doing it with your kids while you're growing up is you're there to process it with them, right? To help them notice when they're feeling cranky. Yeah. Things like that. So they're learning so much about themselves. So as they move more out into the world, this is a level of self-awareness that a lot of people don't have. Right. So that's a really cool thing. Yeah. And so to me, I know it's really kind of termed radical unschooling, but for me, it seems less radical, because once you're learning that way, it just seems to me anyway, to be kind of the next logical extension. Okay. So I can see them learning so well about all these things curriculum wise, but then learning about themselves is just the next step in the journey for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when we go to difficult conversations, and how I've dealt with that, for me, when I look at certainly friends and family, right? Unschooling is for my friends and family, like I said, I hadn't even heard of homeschooling, before we started. So none of my friends and family knew of such a thing, right? So it was very outside their experience. So I learned pretty quickly, I was excited about it, or I'm still excited about it because I'm still talking about it. But for me, conversations came about the other person. And here we go back to that curiosity again. Are they actually curious about it? A big part of the process was about me releasing my need for their approval about our choices. That was a big part, so that I didn't feel the need to convince them that what we were doing was good or right or anything like that. Because when you're trying to convince them that they're right, then everybody feels more defensive, right? And then a conversation doesn't flow.
Yeah.
So getting to the point where I understood that we are all making the best choices that we can, right? It isn't about me trying to convince them. We don't know everything about theirs, and understanding that they don't know, they're not living on my shoulders, seeing everything that happens at home during the day, how things are, they're just seeing the big picture. They're not going to school. Right. They're not doing this, right? So I can't expect them to understand. And if they're not curious to actually learn more about it, there is no value, and it creates more disconnect in our relationship if I'm trying to convince them to get their approval, to get their okay, right? The other big thing I learned was to not ask them for feedback on things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that was so huge. Because why would I expect them to give me an answer different from the conventional viewpoint, right? Because that's where they are. That's how they saw things. And so I'd be setting them up to give me a conventional answer, which I already knew I probably wasn't going to take, their advice, because that wasn't the way I was looking to move forward in our lives, in our unschooling lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I realized that I was just setting us all up, for them to be, well, however they feel about, sharing their advice, because they're trying to help. Mm-hmm. They're trying to help from their heart, right? Mm-hmm. They want to help. You're asking so often, like I learned so often, it's like, at the beginning, if you brought something up, well, put them in school, was often the answer that they would give, like, and you can't blame them for that answer at all, because, you not having, time to do XYZ, or, them wanting, looking for more friends, or, in their mind, school is kind of the answer to all those things. And then once you're in school, if there's still problems, then, we can discuss further. But they couldn't get past that as the solution, because that's the really weird thing that you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I learned to take my questions of those kinds of natures to my unschooling circles, right? Because that's where I was going to get feedback that I wanted to move forward with, that was coming through the lens of the same lifestyle that I was trying to cultivate. So it would be more helpful for me. And that when I was with people, friends and family who weren't as curious about it, who had their own conventional take on it, that wasn't the place for me to bring my concerns or to bring my questions. There, I would remember how happy we are with our choice, how much fun we were having as we were unschooling as a family. And I would bring that fun stuff to those places, right?
Yeah.
So I would be confident in our choice. I would, bring stuff to do. The kids and I would talk about, the fun things to do with your grandparents, what do they like to play? How can they connect? So we would set up visits with friends and family to be fun, because that was the point of them. Those were the fun relationships that we wanted to cultivate. So we wouldn't bring those other aspects of our lives into it, into those conversations, unless the other person was curious about it.
Yeah.
Then I'm all over it.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, one of the things that you were sort of mentioning in our own processes is something that unschoolers are very familiar with, is that parents have to go through their own process of deschooling. You talk about needing to kind of unpack, what did we learn about school and learning and how to raise kids and all of those things. And there's a process for parents. And so often in conversations I've been having in this podcast, it's very similar in that when you're having a difficult conversation, often there's a lot of your own work that you need to do to be able to bring your best self to a hard conversation about something. And so it's similar. We often think of parenting and our choices about school as primarily about the kids. And then when you start really getting into it, and that's one thing I appreciate about unschooling, is that it does actually ask a lot of parents, which is sort of the opposite of what most people think. But it does ask a lot in that we have to unpack, well, where did we get our ideas about schooling and how kids learn? And then what do we need to kind of let go of, like you were saying, being able to let go of other people's approval and feel confident about your choices and kind of understand why you think different things. It's great because it does ask a lot of parents. And, we've talked a lot about curiosity. The other sort of side of the coin, I think, that I always come back to in unschooling is connection. So we see our kids' curiosity and want to follow that and encourage that, cultivate that. But then also it requires a lot of connection with them to know what are they curious about, to know what are they doing on their computer or their tablet or phones? What are they interested in? What are the videos they're watching on YouTube? And what are the things that they're into? You have to be connected to them. And so even though we've let go of a bunch of these other things that people have sort of set as markers, maybe in some ways, of good parenting, like bedtimes and food choices and all of those different things, I find it does require a lot of me to do a lot of work on my side. And I find that is also true in hard conversations. Yeah, just another area that I see kind of overlapping with some of the other conversations I've had.
Yeah, I love that because it's true. It is when we talk about deschooling, the transition, so much of it is the parents, right? Mm-hmm. I found like even, my kids were in school for a while, so they did need some time to transition out of it, but they were excited, right? So this was their chance to dive into all the things that they didn't have the chance to do because they had school in the picture, which took up so much of their time. And so much of it is the parents' work. But, as I look back on it, that was so valuable and continues to be so valuable because really I think it's the journey of a human being. It's not just the journey of being a parent. So much of what I've learned, like you said, this leads into being able to have difficult conversations. Whether or not you're a parent, that's really important, right? Developing those kinds of skills, that level of self-awareness, of understanding, of being able to meet someone where they are. Skills that I developed because I wanted to unschool well with my kids, but I can now see how valuable that understanding is moving forward just out into the world. Like, I ended up writing the Unschooling Journey book because I saw just so much of how my journey was a bigger picture journey, not just about being a parent to my kids, but the person I wanted to be, the parent I wanted to be, the person I wanted to be. That was the journey that I was actually on without knowing it at first, right?
Yeah. So another aspect that, we've been talking about unschooling in very positive terms. You and I both are big fans of unschooling. It sometimes can be received by other people as criticism. It does kind of have this component of being critical of maybe where we feel like regular traditional schooling fails or isn't the best, at least for our kids. But often it feels to a lot of people like a bit of judgment and a bit of criticizing whatever they're doing and whatever their choices are. And I find that's sometimes where the really hard conversation comes from, right? That people receive it as, well, they're not doing something as cool as we are, so, or as awesome. And so, we're maybe judging their choices. And usually, maybe there are some people who in early stages of deschooling probably feel that a bit, feel pretty critical and judgmental about schooling. What are some ways that you've kind of dealt with that? Maybe personally, just in how you react to people who are schooling, if that was a struggle, or how you react or how you deal with people who take it as criticism or take it as a judgment that you made this choice to unschool.
I love the question, and there's a lot of ways to take it. If you can tell from their tone or the way they've phrased the question that they are being judgmental, that really the question is just the mask or the frame for which they want to share their judgment of your choice, right? Then I'm not going to engage in that. You can totally accept that's where they are on their journey and that's how they see it. And they're not open to considering alternatives. They just wanted to share, so you can just acknowledge that and change the subject. I can see why how it looks that way. Something, depending on what the question was, you can just acknowledge it and move on. That's the old, pass the bean dip as it were, right? You are not expected to defend yourself.
Yeah.
But this is part of the journey to getting to that point where you don't feel defensive or you don't feel, so often we freeze in moments like that, certainly at the beginning of the journey, right? Because we take it as a judgment. And especially at the beginning when we're not quite sure, we don't have that confidence, just because we don't have a lot of experience with it yet, we can freeze. And that's okay, because that's where we are too. We can just change the subject. Sometimes, I've even excused myself to go to the washroom. You don't have to stay in a conversation. A conversation is two people choosing to participate, and if you're feeling uncomfortable with it, you don't have to participate. You can just say, I gotta go. Oh, my kids need me, or, whatever. I think that's the first thing is understanding that you don't have to participate in it. And when it comes that understanding their tone, like just seeing the question that they're asking and how they're asking it, I'm back to that curiosity again. Are they curious? If they're curious and open to hearing what you say, for me, that's awesome. So what I do at that point often is now I can meet them where they are. Like for me, that's a big piece of not coming across as judgmental. I'm not going to expect them to do the work, right? I'm not going to share something immediately that's like so out there that it doesn't make any sense to them, because then I'm expecting them to do the work to jump from where they are to where I'm trying to take them.
Yeah,
but
and I think
if I want to have
go ahead.
As you say, if I want to have the conversation, I want to meet them where they are, right?
Right. Yes, that's a really good point. And I think it's it's different for different people, different personalities, and maybe where we're at in the process. I tend to be the kind of person that wants to like unpack things and talk about them, and I don't mind a little bit of the debate about it or whatever. Other people maybe are like want to avoid those kinds of conversations, and I think it's what you're saying is really, really helpful for a lot of conversations, not just around your choices about schooling.
Yeah, because it's your choice. Like whatever the conversation is about, it's first off your choice to participate. So like you said, you are more comfortable with that. It's all about where we're comfortable, and even comfort, not as in it's easy or it's simple or anything. You know what I mean? Like it takes work to meet the other person, where they are, to figure out what you might like. To me, the next piece is trying to share something that meets them where they are. Like, and I can often also validate where they are in that moment. Like if somebody actually wants to have that conversation and they ask a question, so often I can say, that's a great question. Or I remember when I was thinking through that too, and then I can try and just share a piece that's like just one step from there, or how I saw things at that moment, and, what that next little bit of information was that made me think. Because really that's all a conversation is, right? Making each other think.
Yeah.
But if you try to make them jump really far, that's where the disconnects happen and the conversations kind of go off the rails, because then you end up often feeling defensive because you're each so far away from each other. You just end up repeating what you were saying, hoping that the other person makes the leap, rather than like, I've had the most amazing conversations just, at my son's dojo. Right. And some parent heard that my kid didn't go to school and they've been seeing him in the dojo, and they're very curious what's going on because, he's very, he's nice to the other kids. He's very attentive and learning and diligent and, all those things that they think are cool. And they're very curious as to how that kind of happened. And I would end up there for a 45-minute class in the back answering someone's questions just because they were actually curious. I thought I was going to turn out turn away and go do some errands and come back when the class is over. And then all of a sudden the class is over because we've ended up in a really fun conversation.
Yeah.
But what's important to me in those conversations, because they're asking me the questions, is their journey, right? So whatever that first question is, I try to meet them there, answer a little bit, that little seed of something different from there. And that flows into the next question, and then all of a sudden 45 minutes is gone.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I'm noticing as I'm just thinking about how we have these conversations with people that aren't unschoolers is unschoolers don't expect people we meet to also be unschoolers because it's kind of so rare and a little bit strange and seems out there to most people. A lot of people haven't come across it. When you're encountering somebody, you're not expecting them to agree with you. And I'm just thinking through this and thinking this is not the case often when we have conversations about other topics. A lot of times people, because they might assume people, maybe they share their faith or they share their political beliefs or something, then they also assume some things about what they agree with them about. And those assumptions are not always good assumptions to make. And so as unschoolers, we don't make that assumption when we talk to people because we're pretty sure most of the people we meet are not unschoolers. I just find that interesting. That's maybe a practice that you learn from unschooling that you can translate into other areas when you have conversations with people. I often find people, when they're talking about different issues, it seems as if there's often an assumption that there's this tacit agreement about what's being said instead of the curiosity that we're talking about that says, what do you think? And ask the question. That I think people want to be reassured mostly, probably. And so they talk about things in a way that like, well, yeah, everybody agrees with this, or they might talk about schooling in a way that's like, yeah, everybody, we need to have metal detectors in every school or something. And you might be like, what? That sounds crazy. Or something else. I don't know. We need to bring back paddling to schools. Corporal punishment is good. And then you're thinking like, this person is talking as if like everyone agrees with them when it seems a little crazy, but maybe people talk that way. I'm thinking out loud here, talk that way because they want to be reassured that people agree with them. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, that is such a great point. Because the other thing I wanted to mention about those kinds of conversations is when I'm answering, talking to people, is I'm always sharing my experience. I'm careful to use that language, like it's second nature to me now. But to share it in a way that I'm sharing my own experience, my own observations, my own insights, not generalizing, right? Because you're right. So often, and that's back to the point where, only if people are actually, so often they're sharing their perspective. So often it's generalized and they're assuming everybody else holds those same perspectives. And I am not at the point where I feel the need to jump in and change it because their perspective is theirs, and if you can tell, like by the language that they choose, by the pauses that they leave in their conversations, whether these are questions or whether they're just feeling the need to get out whatever it is they're thinking, right? You can sense the difference in those kinds of conversations. And that also helps me choose where I'm going to, hang out and have conversations. Like sometimes my kids would choose activities or want to do things where, the parents would end up hanging out for a while and people would have very different opinions about school, about politics, about all the different things, right? And so often, especially when they're sharing negative things like, oh, school this, school that, but they're just wanting They're just wanting that camaraderie, right?
Mm-hmm.
For everybody to jump, oh, my kid's the worst at this, or, they never listen, or, there's just this kind of pile on bashing that seems to happen, that they seem to be getting a certain level of comfort from.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to step into the middle of that, because they're not open. Their premise is fixed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not a moment for a conversation for something different. But, week after week, eventually, they find out my kid doesn't go to school.
Mm-hmm.
Or something happens. Like, things don't have to be immediate.
Yeah.
That's why we talk about this as a journey,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to come into, and I think about conversations, like those moments, as planting seeds. I'm planting the seed that I did not participate in that jumping on
mm-hmm.
of
mm-hmm.
kids.
Yeah.
They'll notice over the weeks that I don't pile on. I'm just, doing my own thing, standing over here against the wall, waiting for my kid to come out,
mm-hmm.
And then they hear my kid doesn't go to school, and maybe they make a little bit of a connection,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
I am still true to myself,
mm-hmm.
right? And seeds can be verbal. They can just be through actions. They can be through not acting.
Mm-hmm.
That's all kind of communication for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I am really open when anyone's curious and wants to learn more.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't need to go out convincing people.
Right.
Or jumping in on them.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Another connection that I'm noticing in what you're doing or what you're saying is you're paying attention to what's behind what people are saying. So people are being negative
mm-hmm.
about schooling, but you are seeing, well, they're wanting to vent. They're wanting to feel sort of like they belong to the group. They have like a sense of camaraderie with others or whatever. And so then you notice, well, they're trying to meet a certain need. And if I jump in and try to convince them how they need to start homeschooling or unschooling, I've totally missed the point of what they're actually saying. And like you said, they're communicating things not just with what they're saying, but with the way they're saying it or body language and all of that stuff. So noticing
mm-hmm.
the communication that's happening is a huge... I notice the ways that people get into unschooling are sometimes very similar. So like your story, people have different problems with the schooling system that doesn't fit their kids very well, and they struggle, and then they look for options. Others, mm-hmm. Have maybe parenting. I know when we became parents and we started reading books, and can't even remember what all we read, but I know for some people, like attachment parenting, and for us, nonviolent communication was a big part of connecting dots that, paying attention to what's going on and behind. So there's lots of different ways that people get into unschooling, but has a lot of those similar aspects of paying attention to people's needs, noticing connection, curiosity.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the journey too, in mm-hmm. that when those conversations are going on around you, you get to the point where you're not defensive about them. Mm-hmm. Like you're not sitting against the wall stewing or feeling judgment from them, even though they're not actually talking to you. Like mm-hmm. certainly at the beginning, you can feel like that's a judgment on your choices, even if you're not telling them. that you're doing things differently. But it really is all part of the journey of understanding people, and when they're open to learning. Because, let's relate this back to unschooling with our kids. Mm-hmm. Sometimes our kids are coming out and they're just excitedly sharing something, and maybe their observation is a little bit off, mm-hmm. but it's not the moment for you to point it out, mm-hmm. because maybe they'll go back, try it 5 more times, and they'll figure it out for themselves. And that is so much bigger long-term learning when they figure it out for themselves. But maybe they come out and they're stuck, and they really want you to help them get over that hump. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're going to answer that question. Yeah, maybe, hey, do you want me to show you how I do that? You know what I mean? Yeah. So these are skills that we're figuring out with our kids, and they apply to our relationships with everybody.
Yeah, and there are so many connections, I think, with the process of deschooling and unschooling. I feel like we could probably fill another hour sort of going deeper and unpacking some of these different aspects. So I might have to have you on again.
Happy to do that.
Yeah. It's probably time to wrap up, and I like to wrap up with 3 questions or 3 things, something that we have learned, something we can do or recommend to people as an action, and then something we want to share, a resource, a recommendation of some kind. And I will go first. I feel like I learned a lot about connections that I hadn't made before between what this project of the podcast I'm doing and difficult conversations, and the ways that unschooling connects with that through curiosity, through needing to sort of unpack our own assumptions and all of that. And it's been a real joy to hear all of those connections you're making that are super, super helpful, not just with schooling choices, but with so many conversations. And it makes sense if unschooling is really a lifestyle, that it would do that. So that's really fantastic. Something that I want to recommend anybody to do. You don't have to be an unschooler to get curious or to connect with your kids, and there's lots of ways to do that. One thing I know a lot of unschooling parents end up doing is playing video games with their kids, different kinds, everything from Minecraft and Roblox to, other kinds of video games. Finding those ways to connect with your kids and what they're doing. Even if you're not going to go fully, all in and jump in the deep end of unschooling, find ways to connect with your kids around things that they are passionate about. It's probably not something you're excited about, at least in the beginning. A lot of times, sometimes parents are they're so mad at video games, or they're so mad at the things that they think are taking their kids away from what they want their kids to be doing, or what they think is good for their kids. Spend some time getting curious and connecting with your kids in the thing that they are always asking to do, or that they are always wanting more time doing, and get curious about that. What is it about it? What's interesting to them? What are they learning? What are they doing? Have conversations with them. What are they watching on YouTube, and why? What are they getting excited about? And it doesn't have to, it is a journey. So don't feel like you got to be unschoolers or not. You can take pieces of it, and I think it helps us on the journey. You and I didn't start out where we are now by any means, right? It can be a really long journey. But that's a small step, I think, towards helping us connect better with what our kids are passionate about and excited about. And that changes us, too, as we do that, I think. Well, something I'll share and promote for sure is your podcast, Exploring Unschooling. That has been a really helpful resource for me and my family as we've been on our unschooling journey. And then you mentioned a book that you wrote, which is available, I believe, through your website, livingjoyfully.ca. And those will both be in the show notes for people to check out. Pam, what are your 3 things? Something that we learned, something that we can do, and something that you want to share?
Well, I had so much fun in this conversation, and because it had me thinking from the perspective of difficult conversations. It's not really a lens through which I'd looked at things, although, we have these conversations in unschooling circles a lot, right? Because unschooling is often a difficult conversation with friends and family, and just with people that you meet, because our lifestyle is very different. But seeing how those ideas work so well on difficult conversations on just about any topic was really exciting for me. One of the things it reminded me too, when I was just thinking about it, that one of the biggest insights or discoveries on my unschooling journey, certainly at the beginning, was how so much of the conventional wisdom around kids' behavior and learning is based on kids in school, right? So learning that when you step outside of those conventional schooling and parenting paradigms, there is that amazing world of, connected, like you were saying, connected relationships and trust and this lifelong love of learning that happens when you don't separate learning from living in the first place. So that's one of my favorite learning. And in fact, I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes from Carol Black. I don't know if you've come across this one. Collecting data on human learning based on children's behavior in school is like collecting data on killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld. That has always stuck out at me because, as I was saying, that first year I was paying so much more attention to my kids. And I could see the difference, right? When we were, like you were saying, diving into that learning through technology, through video games, through YouTube, those are just the tools to understand and connect with them and seeing what the actual interest is. Like the interest is not YouTube. They're not going to open a YouTube window and not hit play on a video and say, oh, this is amazing. Right? YouTube is just the tool. What is it that they're watching? Learning so much more about themselves. So yeah, what we can put into action is very similar to yours because it's engaging more with your kids, listening to them, helping them do the things they want to do. And really importantly is giving them the space to make some choices. Like, yeah, maybe not all choices, certainly not at the beginning, but just start, take that little step and doing things at their pace rather than our timetable. The revelation that they are so much more capable than we give them credit for is spectacular, right? Yeah. They are very capable. They can express themselves. They can when they have that space to do it on their timetable. Right? To explore on their timetable. When you see all the things that they would spend more time on, given the option, as you were saying before, it's just so amazing to learn that much about them. And really, that's what I recommend is just being with your kids more with curiosity instead of judgment, right? Not looking at them with the eyes like, oh, you're still doing that. You're still doing that. Why do you want to do that? But curiosity as in actively and openly saying, oh, why are you still enjoying that? What, asking those questions and actually looking for answers from their perspective through their eyes. Why is that bringing them so much joy?
Yeah.
Why do they want to do that? And then helping them pursue that. That's the whole thing is when you do that, it's kind of like a power shift, right? A shift in your relationships. They're not power based. I don't assume that I know more. I have more experience. But when I get to know you, your choices and your behavior and all those things, they make sense now, right? Yep. They're not like out of the blue. They're not, I understand that you're not trying to frustrate me. You're making a choice because of whatever it is in you. Maybe you don't like that kind of thing that I'm trying to get you to do. Maybe you don't want to stop what it is that you're doing. Like they are a real whole person. And when we recognize that and support that, like life is so different, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah. I also want to recommend to people, if you're interested in going deeper into unschooling, obviously there's Pam's website and podcast. There's also tons of unschooling groups on Facebook. I'm part of one for Texas unschoolers, and I'm sure in Ontario and different states look for those unschoolers and groups on Facebook to join. We often have people in the group who are brand new even to homeschooling, and unschooling now is much more a part of the mix if people are moving to homeschooling than when you started. And so people are curious and they're coming to groups to learn. So people are used to answering these questions. And like you said, if you come with curiosity, people have lots of helpful things to tell you about unschooling.
Yeah.
Pam, thank you so much for spending your time and talking to me. This was super fun, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Well, thanks so much again for inviting me. I really had a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on Support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?